Hello everyone. My name is Nancy and I love building. I have been living and breathing and building in this world for 2 years now, and I have really spent my time concentrating on becoming a better builder, but more importantly, on having more interesting builds. Ever since I picked up YouTube, I always thought, how can I make this build look better in a thumbnail? And then one day I learned the simple rule to make every single build I do a little bit more visually interesting and something that really catches someone's eye. I'm a little bit dying of cringe because this feels a little bit too self-promoting and a little bit clickbaity, but I promise you it's not like that. I just want to share something cool I learned. So before we get started, let me show you what kind of builds I started off with, such as this cabin over here, which was my very first build on this world. It's pretty basic for a day one build with only spruce and stone available to me. And this over here is my most recent house build, which follows a very similar shape. You know, we've got a rectangle with a triangle roof on top of it, but I will say it's definitely a lot more visually interesting. And visual interest is what this rule is all about. So let's get into it. Shape, color, and texture. This is the big three of building, at least for me, and definitely for this rule. What the rule is that you have to pick at least one to focus on and make it interesting. Now, what interesting actually means is kind of up to you and it's personal taste for sure, but if you want a visually interesting build, you need to have at least one of these three things be interesting. And in a similar vein, if you have too many of these things, then it's going to look very cluttered and busy, so it's all about balance. You can do a mix of all three to an extent, but if you're really going crazy with something, make sure it's just one of these things. If that was a little bit confusing, let me try to explain it this way. If your build's not interesting in shape or color, it should be interesting by texture. And if it's not interesting by color or texture, it should be interesting by shape. And finally, if it's not interesting by shape or texture, it should be interesting by color. So that leads us to our next question. What exactly is shape, color, and texture in Minecraft builds, and how do you make it interesting? Well, I thought it'd be easiest to show you with some examples. So let's look at a blank build. For example, this stone box right here. This is just a square. It's got no texture because it's all the same block. A block that's got a fairly neutral texture, and it's really not got much color. It's all grey. It's all grey. So in terms of ranking this as like a shape, texture, or color intensity, I would say all of these things are pretty much at 0. This is as kind of default and empty as you can get on a build. Now, of course, square is a shape. So when I talk about interesting shapes, I try to think of it as things that break up a shape that we expect, such as a square being, well, a square. If we were to make an indent inside of it, that is already a lot more visually interesting. Same thing can be applied by stacking more shapes on top of it and then maybe breaking them up, or switching from only using squares and adding in triangles, sharp diagonal lines, curves, and all things like that. Shape is all about giving the build dimension, so you make sure that you're not working in a 2D space with shape. Sure, we have something that comes up here on the height, but we also have something that goes in here. In the same vein, you could have something here that comes out a little bit. So if you want to work on an interesting shape, or your shape is super cluttered like this, then you might want to tone back on textures or colors. Color is the simplest thing here to understand. Color is color. If you have bright, bold, vibrant colors, they're gonna grab a lot of your eye's attention. Even though all three of these builds are more interesting than just a plain stone box, it's probably the brightly colored one that's gonna grab your eye the most. So color is incredibly powerful, even without changing the shape and having a very plain texture, such as using concrete. You have some really bright colors, especially when paired with the absence of colors in other blocks. This is going to grab your eye and just bring a lot of visual interest to the build. And last up is texture, which I personally find a little bit difficult to explain. But if we go a little bit further away here and you try to kind of unfocus your eyes and stare blankly into the box here, what is it about it that draws your attention the most? It's probably the cobblestone that is really grabbing your attention because we have a lot of detail here. So texture can just mean detailing to an extent. It can also just mean the texture of the build. You know, what kind of blocks are you using? Are they very plain blocks like stone, or do they have a very complicated texture that's got a lot of different colors on it? I think it'd be good to think of texture as something that kind of breaks up a monotone wall a little bit. For example, if you have a full, big, massive wall, like one of these back of my builds, what is it that's going to make it more visually interesting? Well, it's about using the similar colors to tell you it's still all part of the same build, but breaking it up with some texturing blocks. Back in my survival world, I think it'd be a good idea to show you a real proper example of using this technique to make a build more visually interesting. I'm going to be very mean to myself and say that the first ever build I did on this is not that visually interesting. Now, I do want to clarify that a build doesn't have to be visually interesting, and that's why I'm using that term instead of building better or something like that. Visual interest is just kind of things that draw your eye and catch your attention and make you think about a build a lot of the time. And it's really a personal preference. If you are building a build, for example, that is meant to be a background piece and its job is to not draw attention and kind of just fill space, then you can use the opposite of this rule and try to make all of those things as simple as possible if you want to have something that accomplishes the opposite. Now, say I wanted to make this build, this little cabin, more visually interesting. I'm going to set myself some rules because I built this on basically the day one, so I only had spruce and stone available. That means for my texture and color, I am very limited to what these blocks can do. So my primary focus in this sort of build would then have to be the shape of it. Now, because it's a house, we're going to have to keep this sort of house shape. So how do we work these things out? Well, I actually made a creative copy of this world so I could play around with the shape of this build using the things I know now and show you how I might update it to, well, a more 2025 Nisi build than 2023 Nisi build. Remember what I said before about making a shape a little bit more unexpected? Well, when you're working with a shape and you're thinking, where do I start? It's a good idea to think about breaking up straight lines. So this is the back of the build. You can see some stuff I've done to it, but it's mainly the front of the build I did. So the front used to look the same with a very straight sort of roof line and a very straight line over there as well, and a very flat sort of face here at the front, which is also part of our shape because side on, it's flat, it's a straight line. So to improve upon that without using more colors or textures, this is what I did. Now, it's not going to be everyone's cup of tea, and I think this actual sort of zigzaggy pattern on the roof is going to be controversial. If I wasn't limited by the blocks or textures, I wouldn't personally do this. I'd find a different way to break the shape up with maybe different colors or something. But this is what we've got. So what we've done here is we've broken up the sort of flat face of the build by extending this porch out and then extending the roof by one as well. That means you can add these support beams as well and make it look more interesting from the front on, so it's not just only brown. We've got a little bit of a breakup, and then you'll notice that the roof is all completely brown with no interesting textures or anything, and the shape, well, it's got nothing sticking out or anything sticking in. So to break that up, I added some windows here, and I've just used the sort of the same materials as I already had on the build. Is it perfect? Absolutely not, but it's not about whether a build is actually better or not. Hopefully most of us can agree that this is more interesting of a build, and that's what I want to focus on. There is a lot more things here for us to sort of look and contemplate about this build. I also broke up the very straight chimney we have with some couple more blocks sticking out. I brought the chimney outwards here a little bit more as well, so it's all about just making this rectangle be less ordinary. And now back to the original cabin. There it is. It's got its own charm, and I do want to say that this build had a completely different vibe and there was nothing around it. Now that it is completely surrounded by all sorts of different builds I did, it sort of does its job really well as just a simple background filler piece, but in my heart, it's always going to have a special story. So now let's discuss color and texture a little bit. I don't want to dwell on it quite as much as shape because these things are, I think, a little bit more obvious, but color is, for example, over here. What makes this build visually interesting? Well, we do have a lot of things going on with texture because we have all these fences and the strong spruce logs texturing everything, but it's primarily the roof of this build that is really grabbing your attention and transforms it from a sort of standard medieval build that you might see in other worlds to something a little bit more unique to me, and it's the very bright colours. And now on to my most recent project, which is still not quite finished, so bear with me if the build doesn't look amazing. But this is my ruined shipyard. It's actually ruins of a really old ancient Roman shipyard, although in universe it's not ancient Roman, but this is what it's based off. And because it's meant to be a shipyard, I felt quite limited by the kind of shape it could have. It's a very sort of symmetrical repeating pattern of a shape, although I do break it up in stages here by crumbling some walls and making some holes and stuff. It's still a very basic shape. I wouldn't say it's the most interesting of a design. And with colors, I felt quite limited because, well, it's meant to be ruined, so it's meant to look like it's built out of stone and it's old and aged, so I was basically facing a very simple shape build that was going to be completely grayscale, and I probably could have gotten away with building the whole thing out of cracked stone bricks or stone itself, but knowing the rule I knew I had to do something to make this visually interesting, and not wanting to change the shape or the color too much, I settled on going really crazy with textures. So I don't think I need to say more. The texturing of this build is really what makes it interesting to look at, because there's so many things going on. We do have different colors, but it's not as bright as, say, sticking on a bright orange roof on top of this thing. It's a little bit more subtle, and it works in some shadow baking and stuff like that. So really just about how many different grey blocks can I use in this build. Now, texturing is very personal to everybody, and I think it's something that people hotly debate in the community. So whether this is block vomit or you like this sort of style of texturing is not the point. It's just about that it's more interesting to look at than if the build was only grey with the same block over and over. Now, before we wrap up, I want to show you one more thing about how to use this rule in different ways, and that is with perspective and angles. You see, you can actually have the same build focused on different things depending on where you're looking at it from. So let's talk about this little shop over here. This is a copper workshop, and if you look at it from this intended angle, most of what you can see is actually just the really bright colors of the roof. You'll find in the shape, especially if you're looking at it head on like this, it's just a flat rectangle because we've sort of made it a 2D object. You're not seeing all the angles of the build. Straight on this way, it would look like a very boring build. But that's where I went really crazy with the colors on the roof. So this brings in a lot more interest. There is sure, of course, some texturing on the build, but it's not crazy, and it's definitely the colors of this that make it pop from this side. On the other hand, if you stand directly in front of the shop, you'll see that I focus a lot more on the shape here, and I turned down the colors and the texture to kind of compensate for that, so it's not too busy looking. Now, of course, we do still have a lot of colors and a lot of texture because that's the style of the build, but we don't have a full-on gradient like this warped wood to copper gradient that I've got on the side. No, it is the shape of the roof that draws your eye here. You see how these rounded corners of the arch almost match the rounded corners of the roof. It's all very cohesive. There's a lot of fun shapes. We break up and soften this rectangle triangle combination with some more gradual curves. Compared to the shelves block over there, it's really the MVP of this build. And you'll see that in the gaps where we don't have the strong shape lines, that's when I add more clutter. Here it would be just a solid wall because our shape is here and our shape is up here. So with this little gap in the middle, that's when we had a little bit of texture and color with this thing. And even more so here, when we don't have the clutter of, say, the copper golems, we use some blocks that are more strongly textured. And it also helps that it all works into a gradient. But what I think this does is it makes for a very balanced build that looks pretty cohesive no matter what side you look at it. If you look at it from this side, it's still going to be visually interesting because there's a lot of different colors. And if you look at it from this side, it's still going to be interesting because there's a lot of different shapes. And just for contrast, I'll show you the back, which hasn't been fully decorated. You can see how much more plain looking it is from the back. It loses a lot of that interest without having that extra detailing and color at the back as well. I think the step of going from a beginner to an intermediate builder might be just learning this rule and knowing how to use it to your advantage. And I think the step of going from intermediate to an advanced and a great builder is probably knowing how to break the rule and when to break the rule when you need to. I don't want to say that this means you should never build something that's got really strong texture, shape and color all at once. Absolutely not. But I do think it's a very good solid starting point if you're looking for something to make your builds more interesting. And that's the main point. If you've ever built something and you look at it and you're like, I don't know why, but this just feels a little bit underwhelming and I wish there was some more spark about it, then pick one of those three elements and see how you can go out the box with it. How can you make it look more unexpected? How can you change the shape or the color of the texture of the build to give it some more extra detail? Okay, it's time to wrap up, but I wanted to say actually that I found this rule off from a fashion Instagram page that I no longer know where it was. It was just like a random thing that popped up. I guess I want to say that I didn't come up with this. The rule said, if your outfit is boring by shape or color, it should be interesting by texture. And sort of repeat all of that for color and shape. If you're boring by texture or color, it should be a fun shape, fun cut of a sweater or like things like that. So not really made for Minecraft, but I heard it and I thought this is going to be amazing to kind of just keep at the back of your mind. Hopefully you guys have found this video useful. I do have a lot more examples of changing up shape, color and texture because of course I build with it all the time. So I might make some standalone videos on all three of those elements if you guys are interested, and I hope everyone has found this useful. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Goodbye.